Now on to tonight's program. I'm pleased and excited to be kicking off this spring season. Tonight's the first program of the spring season with a speaker who embodies personally so much of what the Forum, through its commitment to free speech, seeks to preserve, namely honesty, courage, integrity in the face of adversity. In January of 1995, David Brudnoy's private and professional worlds collided when he announced to his radio audience after a long sick leave, "I'm a 54-year-old homosexual, and I was sick. I was suffering the first attack of HIV, the AIDS virus." Since then, he has put together his story in a candid memoir titled "Life is Not a Rehearsal," a book that has not only freed its author from pretense, or what he calls the rehearsals of his life, but by example invites the rest of us to seek such freedom too. As Governor Wells said of Mr. Brudnoy after reading this memoir, Boston's outspoken, conservative, libertarian, gay, agnostically Jewish, living with AIDS, college professor, and media icon proves once and for all the inadequacy of labels when it comes to defining a life. With that as introduction, I'm very honored to present to you Mr. David Brudnoy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have been here once before on this stage with my friend Mike Barnacle of Channel 5 in the election season of 1992, and it seems like yesterday. Bill was mentioning all the distinguished people who have been here before. I think the only one who'd fully understand me would be Margaret Mead, given my rather strange folkways, I confess. I've come to the subject of AIDS, obviously, both as an observer before I knew myself to be infected with HIV, which we presume now with ample evidence to be the AIDS virus, and also, of course, as one living with it. And what I want to start with and also end with, if I might, today is a look at where we are now and try to explain to you how I think we've come here. We have come to a point now where the news about AIDS is in many ways good. My friend Andrew Sullivan, who was editor of the New Republic for several years and is himself gay and has HIV positivity, has not yet had any infections, thankfully, and is a terrific guy, wrote a piece in the New York Times Sunday magazine a few weeks back about the good news that AIDS is on the way to a cure, for which, of course, he was excoriated because it seemed as if he was diminishing the intensity of the infections with people who currently have it, and also the fact that the vast bulk of people in the world are not getting the sort of treatments that Andrew will get when needed and that I am getting at the moment. He was interviewed recently in Arts and Understanding magazine. It's a magazine for people with AIDS. You didn't realize we had such in the February issue. And I just wanted to read you just a few sentences from Andrew Sullivan. One of the worries about the piece, he's referring to the one in the New York Times, was, I'm going to tell people it's all over when it's not, but what about the people out there who aren't even fully aware of the treatments that are available, who are depressed and hopeless, who need to be told there is real hope. Most people in the middle of this epidemic are in shock. Many people have not been tested. I'm still surprised, he writes, at how many people I know are very passive in their own treatment, how many people are still so terrified that they cannot act. There is such an emotionally and morally fraught subject about this that anything can offend, hurt, and wound any number of people. And I have found that in my own experience. The other day I was talking at the Boston Public Library, a few weeks ago rather, and just talking about my book and reading a few passages from it and trying to lead people a little bit into an understanding of what I'm about and the experiences that I have gone through, often with enormous profit for understanding of myself and of the world around me. And one guy said, I'm very angry. And I thought, what have I done? And he said, I'm angry because I'm not getting any good news from the treatment. And I'm angry that people think it is over, that the disease is conquered. I'm sure he meant that people think it's conquered in the first world, in our world, where the expenses are such that with good insurance, or if you have a decent job, you can afford this horrendously expensive treatment, but in the third world one cannot. And I said to him at that point that I understand his feeling that there is no way to guarantee that anything we are currently on will last, and moreover, that about 15% of the roughly 90,000 people currently on what is referred to as the AIDS cocktail, a combination of 3 drugs, will survive it. As I was sitting today at home and thinking exactly how to get into this discussion tonight, I remembered a book that I had read back 8 years ago. I'd interviewed Susan Sontag. I've interviewed her many times. She's a remarkable interviewee and writer. And she'd written a book at that point in 1989 called AIDS and Its Metaphors. And I remember that I was interviewing her approximately a half year to 3/4 of a year after I had been diagnosed. I have no idea when I was infected, but I was diagnosed in the late spring of 1988. And I remember that Susan said something in her book that seemed at that point shocking, because we knew by then that there was a viral cause. We knew it was transmitted through the blood in a variety of ways that I think you all understand. We knew, in other words, it was very contagious, but not through food or touch or the air or doorknobs or toilet seats or anything like that. And we knew enough to know that people got very ill very quickly and died rather gruesomely very fast. And she said in her book, she said at that point that quote, "It is simply too early to conclude of a disease identified only 7 years ago that infection will always produce something to die from, or even that everybody who has what is defined as AIDS will die of it." And looking back at the book, and I was struck again by that couple of sentences, and I thought, how good of her to have given some hope then when it seemed impossible. It seemed impossible that people would survive it, because all we saw was this quick turn to illness, to terrible infections, to debility, usually to a weight loss and an almost shrinking of the individual into his, usually his, but sometime her body, and then a death that none would want. I mentioned the way it was and the way it is for a couple of reasons. First of all, to give you a sense of the trajectory of the disease and what has happened, and secondly, to help explain a little bit of why my own reaction to my illness was, in retrospect, so bizarre, and the term is perhaps even gentler than it ought to be. I was brought to write the book despite the fact that I thought I would not live to finish it. And of course, now I have the feeling I may be around for a long time and people will have to put up with me. My producer and friends will have to face me for a long time. I was brought to write it because the person I just mentioned a moment ago, my producer and good friend from WBC for many years, Kevin Myron, had said, "You got to write it, you got to write it, publishers want you to write it." I said, "I'm not well, I'm not going to make it through." And I finally realized that maybe whether I made it through or not, I would have to give it a try in order to explain to others the foolishness of my own behavior, the rehearsals of my life, especially in terms of taking care of myself, which led me nearly to death in October of 1994, and also the lessons that one can learn, because we are, after all, the species that learns from experience, not only from the repetitive physical act, chasing around to get the cheese on the maze, but rather we learn from the philosophical experiences of trying this and finding that that works better than the other. And when I started to write it, as a matter of fact, as I was going through it in late 1995, when I began it, and early 1996, I even said to my editor at Doubleday, in case I don't survive this, and I mention a name, have him finish it. Now, I mean, I know that's very type A, isn't it? You know, you're writing a book about how you're alive and you're already planning to be dead so somebody else can finish it. But I am an historian by training, and I have a sense of the longevity of these things. The story that I tell in my book, and that I've told now to the point where I'm almost seeking to have interest in myself, I hope I can evoke some interest in you for it, is one of a person who by no means in any way, shape, or form could be referred to as deficient in at least the genetic inheritance of intelligence. I am not a dumb person, but I behaved in a very dumb way. And the way I behaved was the way that we refer to usually as denial. Now, I want to tell you how I got to that denial. I did not believe that I could be infected with HIV. I didn't believe I could be infected with it, not because I am a saint or a monk, though I have taken up monkish behavior now, sort of belatedly, and it's all right, actually. But because I didn't do the things that I thought gave people AIDS, and I didn't and don't. But there were other things, and I explain in my book, that one does that can give one HIV positivity, and I was one of the exceptions. When I learned that I was HIV positive in the late spring of 1988, I was sort of shocked by it. I was very calm in what I said I would do about it, and I said I would do the right thing. A friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, now gone, had been diagnosed the year before and was experiencing a variety of really terrible things going on, not only in his body, but also in his head. He was becoming, in many ways, paranoid, more so than before, and was becoming, I thought, an exemplar of what is often referred to as AIDS dementia. Whether it was AIDS dementia or not, we don't know. It is estimated that people with HIV positivity for a period of time begin to have some deficiency in their memory, in their conception of things, and certainly there are friends who know me now who say, that's what explains you, David. Oh, and I say, no, probably in my case it's always been that way, but whatever. My friend I'm not sure about. He was always weird, lovingly weird, but strange. And I call him in the book Blitz for a reason I needn't get into here. It had to do with privacy, something that I had violated unintentionally. And this friend of mine had gone through the experience of getting very ill and seeing a variety of doctors, sometimes paying attention to his doctors, sometimes not. And we had both known people who died of AIDS, I write in my book, but we were living in a haze of hope and denial and couldn't imagine, even Blitz, whose sexual preferences were risky, as I thought mine were not, that we could be infected. Blitz and his doctor published a serious article attempting to attribute AIDS not to sexual behavior per se, but to previously acquired deficiency owing to drug abuse. He was drawn to the theory propounded first by Dr. Peter Duesberg, a retrovirus specialist, that HIV was not the cause, nor perhaps even a cause of AIDS. With his brilliant mind and exquisitely clear and elegant prose, he could make a believer out of almost anybody, but in his belief that he would not fall victim to HIV, he was proved false, and by 1986, he knew that he was HIV positive. As his condition began to decline in the late 80s, Blitz became, understandably, obsessive about his health, sometimes devoting entire days to filling out insurance forms, reading about the latest AIDS research, and visiting doctors, sometimes 2 or 3 for the same condition, though for long stretches he refused to take AIDS-related medications that his specialist prescribed. When I was diagnosed with HIV, he introduced me to his doctor in Washington, who was the co-writer of his first piece on AIDS, and convinced me as a well-recognized public person in Boston to have my treatment and diagnosis confined to Washington, avoiding any AIDS clinic in Boston. He was right about that, and I did as he urged. He grew very ill and very strange, and for a long period of time near the end would not speak to me or any of his other friends. And one day I came back from the gym of a Saturday morning in early November of 1989 to find a phone message from his roommate. As soon as I heard his voice, I knew. I called back, talked with the roommate and with his father, Blitz's father, and was told not to come for the funeral because it would be private and immediate, but please come visit in a week or so. And I said I would. I sat stunned by my telephone. This was the first death from AIDS of a dear friend of mine. I mean, I knew people who died of it, but we know people who die of things. And unlike those people who say, oh, I've lost 800 friends to AIDS, I don't know of any human being who has 800, much less 80 friends, but I was spared that. I didn't know a lot of people who had died of AIDS. I wept and walked around the house looking at things that he'd given me and pictures of us on vacation. I wrote a piece about him in the Boston Herald, and a commentary was delivered by me on radio, and it was a commentary talking about what he was like. I said, in the piece in the Herald, which I also said basically on the air, quote, as Mrs. Lohman says of her husband Willie in Death of a Salesman, attention must be paid to this man. We pass into life and out of life so fast, attention often amounts to a small obituary notice and then to the dark encompassing shroud of forgetting. I could not let Blitz leave without commemorating his life, the premature cutting off of which has deprived America of one of its most brilliant men and his loving family and friends, of a remarkable, loving, loyal brother. I was jolted when a few days later I received a letter from Blitz's father from New Orleans saying that I had betrayed him and his family and Blitz and that he cast me out of the friendship circle of their family forever. I never figured it out, what exactly I had done, because Blitz had told everybody he knew that he had AIDS, and his parents were very supportive of him, of me, of his lovers and friends and so on, and welcomed us into their home and so on. So I was very surprised about it, but I realized later, even now it's nearly 8 years since his death, and I've yet to hear from them directly, though of late I actually heard indirectly that they're interested in reading the book. I fear that they will read it and give me another decade of no contact. But I realized that what I had done was assume, which is always dangerous, I'd assumed that because they had seemed confident in their ability to handle the nature of their son's illness and death, that they were. I don't call it hypocrisy. I'm not sure it is something as fixed as that. I call it a kind of cognitive dissonance between the event itself, AIDS, and their reaction to it and what it meant to them. It suddenly must have meant to them exposure, that their son, whom they and their friends and neighbors knew was gay, had actually died finally of this terrible thing. This was 1989. Well, this was the milieu in which I was infected, or at least diagnosed, and in which I took my treatment. And I took it, as I mentioned earlier, by seeing a specialist in Washington. I saw him 3 or 4 times a year, and having my own private doctor in Boston provide blood tests of me and then send the results to Washington. And through this combination of having somebody here watching me carefully and somebody there who was a specialist whom I saw and who prescribed drugs for me, which I got under a pseudonym at extraordinary cost, I was providing myself with a privacy that I wanted. Now you may ask, well, why privacy? It's not illegal to have a disease, no. Nor was I in an endangered position. I did not live in an area where people would be likely to throw stones at me, nor did I live in an environment in which my job was insecure, though the next direction became insecure for a brief period of time. But it was because I did not want to be defined as such. And you may say, how do we define people if they have an attribute that goes beyond their simple humanity? Everybody's male or female, everybody's old or young, etc., etc. But we define people as former Watergate co-conspirator or failed presidential candidate or whatever. And you understand that whether it's good or bad, we reduce people to a description that is only a portion of what they are. Because nobody is just the black guy, the Jew, the gay guy, the handicapped person. Nobody is just that. Everybody is a combination of ingredients. And the ingredients that people are sometimes get shunted to the side while one attribute, in this case, he who has AIDS, gets mentioned. I decided I didn't want that and wouldn't have it. Now that's all well and good. And if asked again today if I could still be private about my health, would I be? The answer is yes. Though I've got to tell you that when I came out of the hospital after spending 7 weeks in 2 hospitals and gradually returning to life and learning things I couldn't do for a while, like walking and so on, that the first interview I ever did on television was early in January of 1995. I'd been on television for years, and I was interviewed by an old friend of mine from Channel 7 days, then the co-anchor of the CBS Morning News, Paul Azan. And Paul Azan was interviewing me. I was here in Boston and was talking to the camera. You know how it works. You're sort of in a vacuum and you look in, hi, Paula. And just asking me what it was like to have come out in sexuality in my late teens and early 20s at Yale, and I said, well, you know, it wasn't all that bad, actually. I said it was difficult first to accept the reality of what I was, but once I had, living a double life wasn't all that bad. She said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you could not announce at Yale College that you were homosexual. You could barely announce at Yale College that you weren't WASP, much less gay. There weren't such things as gays at Yale. There weren't such things as Jewish presidents of Ivy League colleges then either, though now they seem to be everywhere, which is all to the good. I wait for the first avowed gay Jewish tacos president of Harvard. I'm ready at any point. All right, in any case. Now, I said this, and meant not that I preferred the double life, sort of sneaking out with my, as my roommates put it, my graduate student friends, wondering what was I was doing with these, quote, graduate student friends when I was an undergraduate, but rather that it was a bearable thing. Well, you should have heard the reaction that I got, not from Paul Azan, but from some of what I refer to as the closet police among the gay lefties, who I think like me less for being one of them sexually than they despise me for not being one of them politically. And it went on and on and on, and I found that in the couple of years since I have been now very public about it all, that oddly enough, the support that I've gotten has come from the vast range of people, but perhaps most surprisingly from people on the right, who, you know, occasionally come up with wonderful thoughts like, which disease is God's punishment? Presumably your great aunt's goiter is not God's punishment, but my AIDS is. I mean, there's sort of a bizarre reaction to disease, but they've been supportive of me, and the people who have been most hostile have been homosexuals, actually. Very strange indeed. There seems to be a mentality that says, if you are HIV positive, you should dash forward, even in the middle of a meal. If the doctor calls you up and says, you got it, you immediately dash forward and you stand somewhere and you announce to the world this. And I tell you this as a roundabout way of getting back to where I started, that I don't feel anybody has an obligation to announce his disease to anybody. You only have an obligation not to infect others, which means if you are engaged in surgery, for instance, you perhaps ought to think seriously about and ask your colleagues and your superiors at the hospital whether you can continue to perform surgery if your blood could in fact contaminate somebody. Despite the fact that many have felt that through the microphone I contaminate people's brains, you cannot give somebody AIDS through radio. And I felt no need to tell anybody about it whatsoever. Anyway, keeping my diagnosis private and functioning with it with a very small support group of 3 friends, one at work, one where I lived, and one who's sort of the man for all seasons, so that in case something happened, I collapsed at work or at the house or whatever, I would have a support group, keeping it to them, not because other friends did not mean a great deal to me, but rather because I felt no need to burden anybody else with something, which after all is a weight. They say that in Chinese culture, that if you save a person's life, it is not he, the saved, who owes you an eternal vigilance and adherence and attention, but you who save him, who owes him that eternal vigilance and concern. The savior must constantly be saving. And in many ways, perhaps because I've majored in Japanese and Chinese studies most of my early college and graduate school life, I've absorbed that somehow when a person knows they can be of help to you, they must take on a terrible obligation. It's a terrible thing to inflict upon people, and I didn't want to inflict it upon people, and I inflicted it upon a small number for the simple reason that I needed that support when things got bad, but I did not need it all the time. Now all this makes sense, at least by my logic it made sense, not to inflict things upon others, handle on my own. I don't exactly see myself as the Marlboro man, but I've always felt I was capable of the strong, silent thing. I can do a lot of things on my own. I learned in my illness in the hospital and thereafter I could do basically nothing on my own, that I was utterly helpless. And when I came to accept it rather than to rail against it and feel diminished by it, that in a sense I think that I was elevated some small degree in humanity and understanding that it is not an evil thing to need others. It is not a weak thing to grant that we cannot all do for ourselves what we wish we could do. You want a talk program, I'm yours. I needed food delivered to me. That I couldn't do. And there were things that brought me finally to an understanding as I was emerging from my hospitalization, that, and when the story had come out finally, that I needed fully to give in to this no man is an island entire unto himself, or itself actually, that we all know from John Donne. However, best laid plans. I thought when I got really ill that I'd know what to do. And I talked about this with my doctor both in Washington and my doctor in Boston and friends, and I said, clearly I'm not going to be able to sort of propel myself in a hospital plane to Washington. If I get ill, then we go to a hospital in Boston. I take care of myself. But as I got ill, over a year period, from November of 1993, when I was in Japan with a friend and developed pain in my feet, which I knew was a side effect of one drug that I was on, and on and on and on into more and more pain, more weight loss, various symptoms, and finally, in late September and throughout all of October of 1994, vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, delusions, sort of cascading into bushes behind the building that I worked at, WBZ Radio and Television, and feet turning purple, literally. I don't mean varicose veins. I'm not there yet, but purple, and thighs bunching up as if suddenly they were the thighs of an athlete. I am not an athlete. And instead of saying to myself, now David, what do purple feet and Carl Lewis-like thighs mean in a person age 54? What's going on here? I said, I have the flu. And I had the world's most weird flu. It was a flu so weird that nobody among my friends wanted to believe it was flu, but only knew that I'm so straightforward, that is, that if I said it's flu, it's got to be flu, though they said, God, you're sick. You are really sick. I lost weight. My weight went down from 175 pounds to 157 pounds. I was in a state, basically, for several weeks of such delirium and such raspy throat that my producer, who sits out in the audience remembering this with a certain shudder, periodically yanked me off the air, not out of evil, but because I literally was coughing, wheezing, gasping, and hacking, and I felt angry at him, would say, Kevin, you can't do this to me. Well, he did. Thank God he did. Anyway, I was in the denial, di tutti denial, as they would say in the inside track. I had a denial that made no sense to anybody. I could look in the mirror, could barely stand to see the gauntness that faced me. I looked at these obscenely chunky thighs. It's edema, it's just water retention, but I didn't know that. I thought, well, somehow, just sitting there, the legs got muscular. I looked at the purple feet. Truly, if you find a purple sweater, it's purple. That was what my feet were, purple. I looked at all this, could not understand what was going on, and said to myself, I will handle this when it becomes something serious, but it's just a flu. This went on and on and on, and I finally saw a couple specialists who literally didn't say to me, by the way, you know, you've got AIDS. They said, gee, we didn't find anything. We did a spinal tap, they found nothing. They did an MRI, they found nothing. Did an echocardiogram, found nothing. And gradually, it dawned on me that, gee, I must be okay. But they knew there was something there, and I was convinced finally by a good friend to let him take me to the doctor the next morning. I'd come back from class that day, and I teach at Boston University. I gave a lecture that the students sat transfixed at. I am teaching journalism, and my students sitting around a large table, about 20 of them, a seminar. sat in the silence that you are doing me the enormous favor of being in right now, and looking at me like this. And I thought, God, what a great lecture this must be. Because when I got back, my friend Ward said to me, so what did you talk about today? I said, I have no idea. But it was a marvelous lecture because the kids sat transfixed. Some months later, I learned they hadn't sat transfixed. I ran into one of my students then who was working in the governor's office, and I was hobbling in with my producer to the governor's Christmas party. It was one of my first sort of coming out experiences from the hospital. And I talked to him, and he said, when I asked him, so why were you guys so delighted by the lecture? What was it? He said, delighted? We thought you were dying in front of us. You know, you've heard of the apathetic students? I said later, I said, please, if you see your teacher who's not incoherent, beginning to give an incoherent lecture, sitting there gasping and lolling his head about, he said, you looked like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. And I said, and you all sat there politely doing nothing. Anyway. All I could say to my friend was, it was a great lecture. Anyway, he was giving me Gatorade and ginger ale and hot compresses and cold compresses and saying, look, I'm taking you to the doctor tomorrow. He lived a few blocks from me, went home to do some work. I'm coming back tonight. I'm going to sleep on the couch, getting you to the hospital in the morning. And I was so weak at that point, though, I thought, how bizarre. He thinks I'm ill. It's just the flu. I'll go. I'll make him feel good. As I said when Kevin would take me off the air, Kevin thinks I'm ill, I'll make him feel happy. I'm fine, but Kevin wants to feel like a nursemaid. Okay. So I lay down on the bed, feeling guilty that I wasn't working on my lecture for Thursday. I teach Tuesdays and Thursday mornings, or grading papers or something. I wandered around my room and I tried to rest. I couldn't sleep. I felt pangs of guilt about becoming a slug-a-bed in the middle of the day, knowing that this nasty flu would pass and I would go on with my life. I looked out my bedroom windows late that afternoon and I saw what I remember as softening colors, shimmering somehow in the light, a warm gray brightened here and there by pinks. A clearer head would have seen all that just as sunset, however lovely, but I was swimming in a reverie, miserable in body, but taken by the gorgeousness of the colors outside my window. I remember one last thing before everything went dark. I wondered how anybody could think that I was looking gray. I was fine, just fine. I was really, really fine. 9 days later, I looked up and I was someplace and I didn't know where I was, and I saw Ward and I saw people in white coats, and I can't swear to exactly what I said, but I think it was something bright like Admiral Stockdale a few years ago. Who am I and where am I? What am I doing? I'm sure I knew I was, but I didn't know why I was where I was. And there was an aunt and uncle of mine that were visiting in New York from Minneapolis, where my family is from, and they had come up to see me because my father knew I was hospitalized. And I thought I was in Minneapolis. Why am I in Minneapolis? The details of this are still vague. What had happened was that between the time my friend left my house, saying he'd be back in a few hours, to spend the night, get me into his car, and to a doctor the next morning to deal with this flu, I had evidently wandered about outside, come into my building, and collapsed. And the doorman of my building had called the superintendent, and the super had called an ambulance, and the ambulance had taken me to Mass General Hospital. I live not too far from the hospital, and evidently, unless you ask for some specific spot, they take you to the nearest hospital, if possible. No recollection of this, you understand. My friend, meanwhile, came back to the house and was told by the doorman that I had been taken in an ambulance to the hospital. Which hospital, I don't know. My friend has medical privileges at Mass General, called 911. They have a record of where ambulances take people. They said, Mass General. My friend rushed out to get his car, which of course had been broken into, so he and his Boston had to take a cab, got to the ambulance, the hospital, and rushed to the ER. It sounds like something out of television, doesn't it? And said, he's HIV positive, and they stuck a drug into me on the off chance it might do something, and it did, and my life was saved. And for the next 9 days, I was in a medically induced coma in order to deal with grotesque pneumonia and heart failure and a variety of other things. And when I woke finally, I felt like Elsa Lanchester in The Bride of Frankenstein. I had tubes everywhere going in, going out, and so on and so forth. And gradually, over the next nearly 2 months, I learned what I had done to myself. I had done to myself the terror of denial because I had every reason then to believe, as we all did, that AIDS was invariably fatal. In other words, my brain was telling me, you'll handle it all right, David, you'll do the right thing, you'll do the bright thing, you will go to a doctor when you need to. You'll say, okay, I think I got it. What do we do about it? My bad brain, you know, the good David and the bad David. The good David was saying, I'll do it. The bad David was saying, no, you won't. You don't want to do this. You don't want to know this. You don't want to face the reality of this. And in refusing help, when help was not only offered, but basically I was implored to accept help from friends and employers. My chairman at the university, my news director at the radio station and television station, and my producer, my friends of all sorts, everybody said, you're really ill, listen, listen, listen. I wouldn't listen. When I wrote the book, as I said at the beginning, I wrote it under the assumption that it would be very fortunate if I actually made it through to finishing it. I finished the book in March of 1996, and final editing in April, and it was ready to go, and they published it a few months ago, and here we are. But I left something out of the book, and I left it out for a reason, and that's what I want to conclude with today. I left out the good news, not because I wanted the book to be morose. It is morose, it's funny, it's all sorts of things that you will find out if you read it. And by the way, each copy of the book is slightly different, so you should buy many copies just to compare them. Some of them I live, some I don't. And so, anyway, I terminated the book with my return to the airwaves. You heard just a snippet of what I said on the air. I determined that I would go back to work if I could. And after a month between dehospitalization and that date, the 5th of January 1995, 2 years and a few months ago, I built up the strength to do it, began to walk without a walker, gradually began to get some sense of possibility here. And I sat before the microphone that day in the studio that was put into my house, where I still broadcast. It's quite nice, actually. It was very nice to have a studio there. Everybody wants one. People say, gee, you can sit there, put on your pajamas and your bathrobe and, and so on and so forth, and you're in your own house. How do you get a studio in your house? I said, well, first you get AIDS, and after that they stop. Anyway, and I sat there and I basically said on the air what you just heard. I explained my circumstance, and I said that I didn't think there was any real secret about my sexual orientation. It certainly was not a secret among people in the know, and that was not a problem with me. But I'd kept the diagnosis of HIV private because of my belief, as I explained to you earlier, that it is no one's business but him who wishes to tell you, and that we do not have the right in our society, we should not have the right to prod people into revelation they do not care to undergo, which is why I say my greatest problems in the last couple of years have come from the closet police among the gay left that believes that it's their business to tell everybody everything about everybody, poor babies. I described what I'd gone through in both Mass General and at the Spalding Hospital. I'm not a brave or strong person, I said, but I think I'm able to be realistic about my lot. I explained I had told everything about my AIDS experience because I realized that rumors not responded to or allegations ignored would serve only to cast me by my own evasion as incapable of facing the reality of my situation, which, as you now know, if you did not then, I had basically not done for those 6 or 7 weeks that I was getting so very ill. And I wanted to make that a never again to be repeated event, never again to deny reality, never again to live in a rehearsal of, I'll do it later, but to do it now when it needs to be done. I'd gone through the experience of telling my father, who's elderly, and my stepmother that I had AIDS. My friend had kept them informed that I had pneumonia and cardiomyopathy and shingles and a variety of other ghastly things, but the AIDS thing I'd kept private, but it was impossible after a while. Part of my denial was that I could keep that private too, even after succumbing and becoming basically a part of a feeding frenzy. I concluded that first hour back on the air on January 5th, 1995 by saying, I feel completely at ease with it all. There's never been a secret about my sexual orientation. The disease is a different matter. And now you know that too. And I said, we'll come back after this. I concluded that first hour back on the air on January 5th, 1995 by saying, I feel completely at ease with it all. There's never been a secret about my sexual orientation. The disease is a different matter. And now you know that too. And I said, we'll come back after this and we'll take your calls and we'll find out what you have to say about what I've just told you. And I can say the same words now, but you don't have to dial 254-1030 to do it. So I'll sit down and take some calls.
One of the features I mentioned of the forum before is the question and answer period. You see a microphone at the head of each aisle here, and this is the time during our program when people are encouraged to come to the microphone so that David can take a few calls. So please proceed down here.
Thank you for saying calls. I even do that in class sometime. I say, a call in the background, sorry.
Bill.
Mr. Hahn.
David, you certainly were very candid with us tonight, but one thing you did not reveal, and I'd like to ask the question now. In the course of losing weight and presumably losing your appetite, did you smoke? And if you smoked, did you inhale?
Bill Hahn has known me for all of my adult life. We've grown middle-aged together, have we not, Bill? I smoke pipes, and that's all I smoke. However, unlike some people I know, when I did smoke things that are naughty, I did inhale. I've always felt one should do whatever one does right. Imagine being applauded for breaking laws. Interesting. Thanks.
Next question.
I was wondering if your illness affected your political philosophy at all.
No, if anything, I think it probably intensified it. My political philosophy has been gradually emerging over many years from the mid-'60s to the present as believing basically that people must be responsible for our own lives, that while we should of course help one another voluntarily, that we should not create a nation of crybabies and dependents, which is not to say there are not people who need more aid than others, but rather that I think that we live in a society in which the assumption is unless government does it, it will not be done, and unless government authorizes it, it shouldn't be done. I find discussions of whether one should be able to have marijuana for medical assistance as something that the president and his drug czar and others discuss seriously grotesquerie. The notion that one denies anybody health and well-being on the basis of the fear that somebody might actually enjoy it seems to me preposterous. I guess if they could inject marijuana into your butt so it hurt, they'd say go ahead. I find the discussion of whether one, if in excruciating pain and demoralization, wishes to depart this life without having to jump off a bridge or slit your throat, to have a doctor help you do this, that this is something we argue about. These are things that a free society would not argue about. Individuals, adults would make decisions for their own lives. So to that extent, I think that my politics remain very libertarian, very much a believer in small government, and perhaps grow even more so all the time. This does not mean, I think, that either Democrats, Republicans, liberals, or conservatives are automatically always wrong, but when they tell me how to live my life, they intrude into the sphere that I think is mine. Yes.
Question over here.
I'd like to say over the decades, the pleasure of listening to you has never diminished by an iota.
Oh, keep saying it. I love it. Thank you very much.
Really.
Thank you.
Whether I agree with you or not, at different instances, I envy very much the student body that is able to have you as a professor. And I'm sure you agree with me, the sanity of the Arizona law, which we were just mentioning marijuana,
yes,
that also allows heroin use for intractable illnesses. We are, under the World Health Conference, the only civilized country that does not allow Category 1 to be used even in hospice situations. And then they wonder why we cry and kiss Dr. Kevorkian's hands. He is the only savior the United States is allowing us, and they are barely allowing us him.
Yes, I agree that a more rational society would look at the effect of well-meaning policies, because of course the policies are intended to do good for us. They are good intentions, but everybody knows what good intentions lead to. The road to fill in the blank is paved with good intentions. And again, to respond both to the gentleman's remark a moment ago and yours, a society that said, look, no one is ever wise enough to make only wise decisions, but when we say that only government can determine what the mass of mankind in this country can do with our own bodies, suggests to me that we have somehow created a class of people of such wisdom and virtue that they and they alone know. Even those that don't sleep overnight in the Lincoln bedroom presumably know more than I for me, but I think not. And I'm with you on that. In other words, I think the problem with Kevorkian being the only savior of the society allows us is that he is so easily demonized because he's unusual.
He's a sweetheart.
I'm sure he is. He's also very weird. I mean, one should not have to have only Dr. Kevorkian. One should be able to go to one's own physician, yes, and say, look, I want help in this. Moreover, I don't believe you should have to have a categorical, I am going to die within 6 months, I have excruciating pain. In other words, we say we have the right to give birth to whomever we can, and also to terminate life in the womb when we will. These rights are in our society. The right to mother and the right to abort. But somehow when it comes to ourselves, we are told we need somebody else's authorization. And I didn't know about the use of heroin in other societies, but it makes sense because, of course, there are reasons that it would be of value to people. And it seems to me our society is still caught up awfully in the sense that we can rewrite the nature of mankind. Maybe some of the older societies in Europe have learned the futility of that kind of, should we say, speculative idealism. Thank you for the point.
I would love one day if you would accompany me to 80 East Concord Street so we could both argue with George Annis and Michael Grodin, and I wouldn't have to keep arguing with them alone over the years.
I argue with him on 50,000 watts, reaching 38 states just this past week. I keep at it. I do what I can, but it's important that everybody, and remember, this is not an issue about which everybody agrees. There may be people here agree with the lady and me and others not, but we at least ought to have it be part of our national discussion instead of these absolutes, you know, this shall not be. I fault nobody for his religious or ethical considerations as long as he will confine the application of them to himself and his loved ones, but not inflict them upon me. I think that's an old-fashioned American way, much honored in the breach, I grant, but the best of America allows people to worship whatever they will, to deny suicide if they feel it's no good. It's nothing I want at the moment. I certainly am not looking to do it to myself, but I would like the right to do it if need be. And I think that if people would just say, look, I will not campaign against your right to be free, though I would prefer not for myself to be. And I know that people of very good will, clergymen and others, disagree with this, but
It seems only the Unitarians have any, well, of course, God is never mentioned in a church, of which I highly approve, but Unitarians seem to have a marvelous understanding of autonomy, because you quoted something previously, the code by which you live. I live under the code of Invictus.
On that note, I'd take another question over here.
thank you.
Thank you.
Sir.
Good evening. I'm just curious if your experiences dealing with the medical community, if you had any experiences that you either felt were extremely positive or extremely negative in the manner in which health care is dealt with in this country, and if you had any suggestions or recommendations by which a person of the general public might be able to advocate their own health, and how people might go about getting the best care that they can. You obviously come from a slightly different situation than most people within the general public.
Yes.
But I'm just curious if you have any new insight from having gone through this.
I don't think so much insight as a validation of what I believe to be the case. I come from a family, I have a lot of doctors in it, medical people of all sorts, and I've always had respect for them. I found myself needing so much guidance and care, and needing to be led often by the hand, not only by friends who sort of took over the functions of my life and in all the mundane and quotidian ways, but also from the doctors who would lead me to understand what was going on in my life. I asked the doctors be frank with me, and hope that they have been, and think that they have been, because I guess I never wanted once again to have any excuse for denying reality. I'd given myself an excuse during that period in the mid-late fall of 1994. You know, there were things in hospitals that were great and things that weren't so great. Try to get a shower on a daily basis in a hospital, and so on. But I mean, in the short view, these seem like terrible inconveniences. In the long view, we have wonderful care, the best in the world. What we don't have is a good insurance system, and there is our problem. In other words, we do not have a health crisis in America. We have a health insurance crisis. You will notice that people do not dash to Saudi Arabia to have their hearts dealt with. Somehow they come here, and they come here because it's the best. I can't conceptualize the way in which we have to improve the insurance circumstance in America. I know that what the Mrs. Clinton's commission tried a few years ago is not the way. It bothers Americans to have that much control in government hands, but something better than what we have now is necessary. I also think we have perhaps to try to do something about the litigiousness of America that has made malpractice insurance more expensive than many doctors just a few years ago earned in a year. They pay now in insurance. But that's only a touch on it. I don't have any profound insights, just feelings. And feelings are basically very good. I was fortunate. But may I just make a commercial for something, if I might here? I hope somebody would ask about this. Because I have a soapbox, basically. I have a radio program, a television, newspaper articles, and can do things like this. I have the opportunity to reach beyond many people who can't do this. They're not broadcasters. And my name is well known, and I wanted to do something that would help alert people to what was currently going on in AIDS, these new treatments that have come around just in the last year, and a fraction among them. And we thought about what to do, and the president of the hospital, Mass General, Dr. Thier, came up with an idea to create a fund for AIDS research, knowing that the answer ultimately will come in the laboratory. We may, through the treatment that I'm on now, bring about a chronic rather than an invariably fatal disease for people in the first world, but in the third world, a vaccine will be necessary. Currently, a third of the military recruits, a third in Cambodia, are HIV positive. An estimated 10 million people in India are HIV positive. Africa you know already about. It seems even worse now in South Asia and Southeast Asia in terms of the rapidity with which AIDS is spreading. So I said, great, let's do a fund. And he said, we'll call it the David Brudnoy Fund. And I said, wait a minute. You know, I don't mind it now. So, I mean, I felt embarrassed at first, saying, gee, I'd like to touch you up for $1,000 for the David Brudnoy Fund for AIDS research. But, you know, what the hell. So the fund exists. Don Imus sent me a check the other day for $5,000 for the AIDS fund. Anybody in here with that account of money, send it to Mass General Hospital. We're seeking $10 million in the next 3 years for AIDS research. I'm the volunteer. There is no overhead because all the business work is done by the regular development office of the hospital, no additional employees. So consequently, all the money goes immediately to the laboratory. I hope that you will think of that as one place perhaps to put your discretionary charitable dollars. My name on it notwithstanding, it goes to the doctors. I am not a medical doctor, and all I say is, we'll put it in your hands. That's the best I can say about the hospital. I want to devote as long as I can to fundraising in this way. I mean, I've always, you know, been involved in this charity and that, but only, you know, a check here, you know, appearance at a celebrity gala here. I mean, nothing intensively involving me, and now I've become a fundraiser. Brings me back to my mother, who was a Hadassah fundraiser. She could get water out of a stone. And I always was amazed at how she could do it. Maybe it is genetic. Ma'am, please.
I actually have a related question to the fund you were talking about.
Yes.
How do you balance out a desire for small government with the idea that some people have the taxpayers' money or government things ought to be fighting AIDS and similar diseases?
Sure. If I had my druthers, we would not be taxed anywhere near where we were, and the money would be in the hands of individuals who would, prior to government funding research for medicine, fund research for medicine. In other words, throughout most of our history here, researchers have come from private funds. The government did not have contributions into medical research when, 125 years ago, the first anesthetic ether was used at Mass General Hospital, and so on and so forth. These were things developed in the private sector. Now, we are taxed enormously right now, and I would be weird beyond belief if I said to you, I think that only AIDS should not be funded because of my principle. So if we're going to be taxed for medical research, then let it be used for where the specialists think it is best used. Everybody's disease is of equal importance and terror to him as is mine of importance and terror to me. And I do not say that one disease is more important than another by any means. But I do believe that if it will not come in my lifetime or in yours, but if at some point we get to a more libertarian society where we have lower taxes, people will reach out voluntarily, as we're doing. We're seeking our money for this fund purely from voluntary contributions, no public funds whatsoever, none, not a penny. I don't want the government involved in it in the least. And it's simply a principle on my part. Tocqueville came from France in 1830 and 31, went back and wrote his little book about prisons, and then wrote The Great Democracy in America, in which he said, this French aristocrat studying our country in the decades before the Civil War, he said he'd never seen a country with as much voluntarism as in the U.S. He said people reach out, they build each other's houses in Amish territory. They plow with one another and share their mules on the farms. They reach out and educate the children of the poor voluntarily. He was not making up an America. It was the America of the 1840s. It could certainly be the America of the year 2000 as well. It won't be for a while, but the lady's asking the question, if you believe in small government, what do you believe about funding for medical research? And the answer is a mixed one. I wish they didn't tax us, but they do, so we'll use it for what we must.
Thank
Somebody
you.
else?
Another question? Go ahead, ma'am.
It was great hearing you.
This side first.
Ladies first, then you. Okay.
Thank you. It was excellent hearing you.
Thank you.
I work in the healthcare field, and I've also been a patient in the healthcare field. And I've experienced negative and positive. And I've also learned that know it's a health care insurance problem, which I definitely agree with you. And some of it has to do with people suing doctors. It's also a doctor problem.
Tell us about what do you mean by the doctor problem?
Well, I think that the amount of money that they charge is outrageous. You know, for 5 minutes, $100. You know, that's really
enough,
outrageous. Oh, actually, it's a lot more than that. $280 I've gotten bills for less than 10 minutes.
Yeah, I know what
you know, a heart, pulse, very simple checking of a physical exam. I guess my question would be, you know, how do you deal with this crisis? You're saying you don't know, you don't agree with socialized medicine. I had an experience one time where I was putting on a monitor, or actually attempting to put on a monitor for a young teenage girl. Her mother had just lost her job. She was getting unemployment benefits. And this is a true story. This isn't like, you know, somebody sitting in front of Mrs. Clinton. And unfortunately, I could not put that monitor on her because she had no health insurance, because she made too much on unemployment. She had 2 other children. I think our care is affected. I think that some people get better care than others, including you, because of your status and your celebrity.
Being able to afford it, yes.
Yes.
No question.
Yes.
No question.
And you probably are treated differently.
Probably.
Rather than the average person. No doubt in my mind, because I've seen some horror stories. And I don't think that doctors are always willing to work with patients, even knowledgeable ones, because of the restrictions that the health care insurances are putting upon them. And I agree with you that our health care is definitely above average. I don't think it's always the best. You know, you have accessibility to medication. I'm sure there are thousands of others that do not, for economic reasons.
Tens, hundreds of thousands. Look, you're absolutely right, but you agree with me in this particular, that the insurance itself puts limitations on what doctors can do. I don't think the format is conducive to a long discussion about the exact precise ways we can reform it, insurance. But we do know this, it is odd, is it not, or maybe it isn't so odd, that people in dire need of medical care leave the countries with socialized medicine and come to America. They leave Canada to come here to get the machines that Canada doesn't have. They leave Britain to come here. They even leave Sweden to come here if need be. There's something evidently that doesn't quite work as well as the theory would have it in the socialized approach, that is in the government funds and decides where it goes as it would. I have no doubt, however, that there are different treatments given according to all sorts of things. We know that there are differences, demonstrable differences owing to surveys of how black and white patients are treated in certain circumstances. Surely wealthy and non-wealthy patients treated differently. I cannot guarantee that my doctors who have a patient load of several people with AIDS treat them differently than they treat me. I don't know one way or the other. I hope not, but you may well be right that they do. And one of my good friends scoffs when I say I don't think they do. He said, of course they do. Treat them differently. I don't know. I don't know. I hope not. But I do know this, that we will never improve the lot of those not getting good stuff by diminishing the treatment that is available at the top of the heap of that which is given, and at the economic top of those to whom it is given. That if we try to level, we will not improve things for anybody. What is needed is an understanding first of preventive care, which God knows is the most important thing that this society doesn't pay attention to. Oh, now you want to lose weight. Okay, we got to wait. Well, now you want to give up smoking. Now you want to do this. Now you do that. We don't do preventive care, and in not doing that, we spend billions of dollars, I'm convinced, in remedial, in patching up when we could have done it better earlier on. I don't think I'm giving a response that's more than just sort of touching on the fringes of it, because I don't know what to say. I don't know how to do it. I mean, I have ideas of all sorts of things. The medical problem seems to me not intractable, but certainly not something that I can come up with some clever, potentially useful solution for it. I don't think all doctors are great. I don't think everybody's given the same medicine. I think, however, that if data count, then the fact that people, when in direst need, come here, indicate that probably we have not just superior, but all told, the best. Not in every doctor, Lord knows, would that it were so, but they were all great. Yeah.
Over here.
Yes, Arthur from Waltham. I'm very glad to have a chance to meet you. I've listened to you for many years on the radio.
Did you ever call me?
A few times, that's what I was saying. I'm Arthur from Waltham.
Oh, right, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't hear it, forgive me.
I'm enjoying your book as well. I've got the way through it.
I live at the end, I guarantee you.
Yes. Glad to hear it. No, but it continues for a long time.
Thank you.
Just as a minor follow-up, if you haven't studied them at all, I would suggest that you might want to take a look in the history of the benevolent societies and societies of friends that existed in some areas between the Civil War and World War I particularly. Of
course. No, I do know that, and that's what I mean. We have here, it is not a new thought to say that Americans voluntarily do a remarkable, even with our high taxes, we have tremendous charitable contributions. Hundreds of billions of dollars are given to churches and all sorts of things, and the benevolent societies have managed, and the study of it, I'm not an expert in it, but I did do some study of it when I was in graduate student school working on American 19th century history. They were able actually to provide a sort of within community protection that basically carried people through in the absence of city, state, or federal help. And we find this among the Mormons.
Exactly.
Who have practically no welfare.
But I was thinking,
I mean, they take care of themselves. The Amish, the Mennonites.
Right, I was thinking particularly in terms of the medical insurance thing, where basically a lot of these were hiring medical doctors for relatively low salary and basically charging their members a very nominal sum every year for adequate medical care.
Yes.
Wasn't the best care in the world, but it was adequate.
Well, given the era in which it occurred, you were lucky if you lived after a doctor got to you, rather than now. So
given the quality of the medical care available, then they were pretty good.
I mean, I know wherever you speak, and I have looked at it, not in the detail obviously you have, but I'm aware of it. And again, I do not want to sound like utopian here and say that, you know, we wave our magic wand, we snap our fingers, and tomorrow we have a voluntaristic society, people dashing forward to take care of everybody. The nature of man has not changed the last time I looked out the window.
Right.
But thanks for bringing up that point.
Yes. No, the other thing that I was really getting up for was just wanted to ask you, I have read some of the Duesenberg people's material and so forth, and I haven't obviously had the professional interest that you've had in the AIDS research and so forth. But a lot of the stuff that he was saying sounded very reasonable to me, and I wasn't able to see very many holes in it. And I was just wondering what your opinion of some of his theories were.
Very briefly, let me do this, because again, I'm not that kind of a doctor. But Peter Duesberg said it seems odd that one of the standard understandings of how viruses and pathogens of various sort affect people, which are referred to as Koch's postulates, were not occurring. That is, that there would be an instantaneous effect upon cells and not a delayed effect of some 10 to 12 years, and a variety of other things that didn't seem to be in keeping with what is known about most postulates. Duesberg is a leading retrovirus specialist. He's not a crackpot or a crank. He seems to have missed the point somewhere along the way, because the massive evidence has demonstrated that he errs in thinking that HIV is not the culprit. Now, he may be right, and other doctors are coming to believe that there may be cofactors that are in it, but let me then bring into the discussion, or at least to mention briefly, how I know that HIV is the responsible villain, as it were, within my body. Once I began the AIDS cocktail, 2 older drugs and a new drug referred to collectively, there are 3 types of them called protease inhibitors, the following happened. They tested my blood for HIV presence prior to the beginning of this, and I had, this will sound a little medical, but I think you'll be able to get it, I had 140,000 copies of HIV per milliliter. A milliliter is a little less than a teaspoon of blood. 140,000 copies means 140,000 of the little buggers. Within a month, I had 1,200, and within 2 months, I had none that were demonstrated. Now, you might say, oh, that's great. The HIV is no longer detectable in your blood. Whoop-de-doo. Well, what about that? Well, there's been a tremendous weight gain. I'm still not exactly what you'd call Schwarzenegger, but I'm not Twiggy either. Weight gain, energy improvement, demonstrable decrease in the pain of the symptoms I had from shingles and from neuropathy, which were quite horrible a while ago and are now much reduced, so that they're just things I put up with, but they're not terrible. And in general, a robustness. And moreover, though I kid a lot about having no memory, and there's at least one person in this audience who's laughing, I know, because he knows I never remember anything he tells me. In fact, my memory's better. So I'm stronger, I'm healthier, I'm more alert, my memory is back, pains are less severe, and the HIV is gone, or at least undetectable. There's got to be a correspondence, and this is the word we're getting from the roughly 80,000 people currently on protease inhibitors, AIDS cocktail, who are getting this kind of result. I think Duisberg, though undoubtedly he's intensely concerned about people with AIDS. I mean, I don't think this is sort of a bizarre man who's lost his mind. He seems to have gotten hooked on this theory that HIV is not the culprit, and from it, all the evidence that gathers around him seems not to register. But again, it's a very big country. He's written a big book on, I think it's called The HIV Conspiracy. Right, no, I think of Dr. Duisberg's most recent book. In other words, it is an argued matter, and the common wisdom is not always right. Truly, the Earth does revolve around the sun. It took a while at a certain point to recognize that. So he may be right, but I doubt it. I doubt it.
Yes, over here.
Yes.
Thanks. I've called your show also. Carla Howell is the name.
Oh, yes, of course.
Nice
Hi.
to meet you.
Hi. Same here.
I'm surprised as a libertarian to hear you say you're not sure what you would do about medical insurance. The libertarian position, as you know, is that repeal all government involvement in health, and in particular, before Medicare and Medicaid, there was a trend of increased voluntary use of insurance, and the trends were clearly showing that people were learning to take care of this on their own, and the government jumped into it, and all hell has broken loose since. So I wonder what you're uncertain about.
Look,
or is it just the political incorrectness, impossibility of it?
Oh, no, I hope you didn't mean the word political correctness in my...
No, I meant...
No,
I misspoke.
I know what our position is. It is, I'm thinking in terms of how we get there. That's all. In other words, I'm understanding, and as you know, I never have to be held responsible for who's president, because I never vote for anybody who wins. I always vote for the libertarian candidate. So I'm very with us on that. I'm only saying that when people ask, what do we do about it now? And I'm thinking, how do you lead people into an understanding of withdrawal from the sense that government is our only opportunity for improvement of whatever the condition may be, health, education, housing, crime, whatever. I certainly think that the libertarian answer awaits us, but only after a long break-in period. I tend to be an ameliorist, I guess. Harry Brown wouldn't like it, but I think there's a need for weaning people of what we've got now. But I hope you have some literature pass out to the people from the Libertarian Party. Good. Okay, good. I hope so. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, David, for telling me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
I just want to keep your attention for one more minute and make 2 or 3 brief announcements. The next program of Ford Hall Forum Spring Season is this Thursday evening at 7 o'clock at Faneuil Hall, and William Bratton will be speaking on community policing. Probably not from a libertarian viewpoint, but the following program is on November 18th at the Kennedy Library, and it'll be a panel on press and politics, and that'll be jointly hosted by Ford Hall Forum and the Kennedy Library. That's the first time we've done that, I believe. Another important announcement is that David Brudnoy's book, all versions are on sale out here in the Frost Lounge. It's the lounge to your right as you go out of the hallway here and off to the right. And I recommend you buy at least a few.
Thank you.
All right. And lastly, and this is very important for everybody to remember, I've just been informed that the steps in front of the building have glazed over with a sort of black ice, and a number of people have already fallen, and evidently I'm a lawyer, so this is all right. That's the way out of the building. So you slip, you fall, and I'll be at the bottom with cards. But be very, very careful when you go home tonight, please. Thank you very much.